The village of Aluo slept in the cradle of the African savanna, where the red dust clung to every footstep like memory, and the air carried whispers of ancestors long gone. The people lived humble lives, tending their goats and yam fields, guided by the wisdom of the old and the blessings of their gods. One blistering afternoon, when the sun stood high and cruel, a stranger appeared walking from the western path, barefoot yet spotless, dressed in a blinding white suit that shimmered under the sun like a spirit's garment. His voice, deep as thunder and smooth as river water, introduced him as Pastor Nuru, a messenger sent from the heavens to bring deliverance and light. He spoke of miracles, of healing and wealth, and of a new dawn that would lift Aluo out of its forgotten state. The villagers, tired of their struggles and eager for hope, gathered beneath the great baobab tree as he preached, his shadow long and powerful against the red soil. When he raised his hands, the wind stopped. When he smiled, the air felt heavy. He prayed for the sick, and they claimed to be healed. He touched a dying goat, and it stood up, bleeding. His fame grew faster than grass after rain, and soon even the chief bowed before him. But old Mama Kemi, the village herbalist and keeper of ancestral lore, watched from her hut, her face tight with unease. "Not all power is holy," she whispered, but her warning was drowned in the villagers' songs of praise. Pastor Nuru chose a piece of land on the edge of the forest to build his church, a cursed ground once said to be home to restless spirits. At night, strange lights flickered there, and drums echoed from the trees, though no hand struck them. Still, the people rejoiced. But the days grew darker. Children spoke in voices not their own. Animals refused to drink from the river, and shadows moved even when the wind was still. One night, a young boy named Tund followed the preacher after service, curious to know where he went. Hidden behind the trees, he saw Nuru kneeling before a fire that burned blue, not red, whispering words in a language no man of Aluo knew. The flames danced with shapes that had faces, and Tond swore the preacher's eyes glowed like molten gold. Terrified, he ran home, but by morning he could no longer speak. When Mama Kemi tried to heal him, she found her herbs had turned to ash. She confronted Nuru before the crowd, shouting, "You bring darkness disguised as light." He smiled, his teeth too white, his shadow too long, and said, "Even the devil quotes wisdom to sound holy." That night, Mama Kemi was found lifeless, her tongue blackened, her mirror cracked beside her. The villagers mourned her, but the preacher said it was a curse lifted. From then on, every night, a wind howled through the village, whispering her name. And as the red moon rose above Aluo, the ancestors stirred, watching their children follow a man who spoke to fire and smiled at shadows. The night Mama Kemi died, the moon hung low and red like a wound bleeding across the sky, and every dog in Aluo howled as if mourning something the living could not see. The villagers buried her before dawn, fearful that her spirit might wander if left under the moonlight. Pastor Nuru led the prayers, his voice calm and soothing, and yet with every word he spoke, the fire by her grave flickered blue, not orange. "The Lord gives and takes," he said softly, "and his will cannot be questioned." But the old men at the back exchanged glances. They remembered stories told by their fathers about blue fire, about how it burned, not by wood, but by souls. That night, As people returned home, the air smelled of wet ashes and burnt palm oil, though no cooking fire had been lit in the distance. A drumbeat echoed, slow and steady, like a heart that refused to die. Inside their huts, families whispered prayers and tied charms on their doors. But even those charms seemed weaker, as if the gods themselves had turned away. In his new church, Pastor Nuru stood alone before the altar. The walls trembled, though there was no wind, and from the dark corners, shadows crept forward like living things. "You must serve me well," a voice whispered from nowhere and everywhere at once. He bowed his head and replied, "I already do." The next morning, people found strange marks carved into the earth outside their home circles, filled with symbols no one understood. Chickens lay dead, eyes open, and their blood drew trails toward the church. The villagers murmured, but fear kept their tongues quiet. When Sunday came, the church was full again, the people desperate for blessings to protect them. Pastor Nuru preached louder than ever, his face glistening with sweat, his hands moving like they commanded the air itself. A young woman named Aduk fainted during the service, her body convulsing as if possessed, and when she finally opened her eyes, she spoke in a deep man's voice, "He is not who he says he is." Panic spread, and Nero quickly placed his hand on her head, praying with such force that the candles blew out and the church was plunged into darkness. When light returned, Aduk lay still, her eyes open but empty, and Nero declared her freed from demons. The people clapped, yet their smiles were uneasy. That night, Tund, the boy who had seen too much, woke to find a shadow standing by his mat. It whispered his name and said, "The ancestors are watching." He screamed, but no one came. In the morning, his mother found only his footprints leading to the church and ending at the altar. The next evening, Pastor Nuru told the villagers the boy had been taken into glory, and though his words were smooth, even the wind refused to pass near him. From then on, every time the preacher raised his hands to bless the crowd, lightning flashed across a cloudless sky, and the red dust swirled as if stirred by invisible hands. The villagers began to wonder if they had welcomed not a messenger of heaven, but a shadow of something older, something that had waited too long in the dark. By the third week after Tun's disappearance, the church that Pastor Nuru had built no longer stood as a house of God, but as something alive, something that breathed, sighed, and listened. At night, when the village slept under the red sky, people heard low murmurs coming from the church whispers in strange tongues, laughter that faded into sobs, and the creak of wood shifting, though there was no wind. The church bell rang by itself, its hollow echo crawling through the village like a chill waking babies and silencing roosters. The people of Aluo tried to live as before, tending their crops and fetching water, but an unseen shadow seemed to follow every step. The goats gave birth to eyeless kids, the wells grew bitter, and even the drums, which once brought joy, now beat with fear whenever anyone dared touch them. Some villagers started avoiding Sunday gatherings, but most still went, driven not by faith but by fear. They believed if they stayed away, the same curse that took Tund or Mama Kemi might visit their homes. Pastor Nuru, however, seemed untouched by it all. He grew more powerful, his voice louder, his smile sharper. His once white suit was now replaced with deep crimson robes embroidered with golden patterns that twisted like serpents. The air around him always shimmered faintly, as though invisible heat surrounded his body. He walked the village like a king, and no one dared meet his eyes for too long, for his gaze felt like fire crawling under the skin. One night, a widow named F came begging for her dying child. Nuru told her to bring a white goat and palm wine to the church altar. Desperate, she obeyed. By morning, her child was healed, but the goat's body was found drained of blood, and the wine had turned thick and black. The villagers whispered, "He has power." But Mama Kemi's old words still lingered like ghosts. Not all power is holy. That night, lightning flashed across a cloudless sky, and the church doors banged open as if struck by an unseen hand. Those who lived closest said they saw shadows moving behind the windows, too many to belong to one man. The next morning, the chief's wife was found sitting outside her hut, her eyes pale, her hair turned white as cotton. She said, "He walks with those who never died." After that, no one dared question Nuru. Children were told never to look at the church after dark, for the spirits inside mimicked human voices, calling names softly, sweetly, until the listener followed. The drums of the ancestors grew restless. Their sound echoed from the distant hills, though no drummer's hand struck them. Even the old baobab near the marketplace began to shed its bark in thin strips, as if it too could feel the fear in the air. Then, one evening, as the sun drowned in a pool of blood-red clouds, Nuru gathered the villagers and spoke with a strange tremor in his tone. "The Lord tests the faithful," he said, raising his hands. Suddenly, the dust whirled into a twisting column beside him, forming a tall shadow with horns of smoke and eyes like fire. The people fell on their knees, screaming, while Nuru smiled faintly and said, "Do not fear. Heaven watches us." But the shadow laughed, a sound like metal scraping bone, before vanishing into the sky. That night, even the crickets went silent. The ancestors' drums beat again, slow and mournful, and those who still dared to dream saw visions of chains binding the village to the church that whispered through the dark, hungry for souls and faith alike. The village of Aluo was no longer the same after the night the horned shadow appeared beside Pastor Nuru. Days turned longer, nights grew heavier, and even the air seemed to tremble with secrets unspoken. The church now stood like a wound in the earth, its doors forever open, its windows glowing faintly even when no candles burned inside. Villagers claimed that if you walked past it after midnight, you could hear the sound of a child crying softly, calling for its mother. And if you stopped to listen, your reflection would appear in the glass, only smiling when you were not. Rumor had it that the child's voice belonged to Tund, the boy who vanished weeks ago, but others whispered it was something far older, something born from the prayers that were never meant for heaven. Pastor Nuru's sermons became stranger. He no longer opened the Bible. Instead, he spoke words from a black book bound in goatskin, written in a language that made even the birds fall silent. When he prayed, blue flames rose from the ground, circling him like spirits chained to his feet. People still came, drawn by fear and fascination, bringing offerings: white goats, red cloth, palm wine, even locks of hair, believing the preacher's blessings were their only shield against the growing darkness. But one night, A storm unlike any before rolled in. Lightning danced without rain, and the sky glowed crimson as if bleeding light. The widow, awoke to find her son standing by the doorway, eyes open but lifeless, whispering, "He is calling me." Terrified, she followed him through the storm, the wind clawing her clothes, until she reached the church. Inside, she saw Pastor Nuru standing before the altar, his hands raised as blue fire burned on his palms. Behind him, shadows moved, tall, twisted figures that bent and breathed like smoke. The missing boy, Tund, stood among them, his face calm, his eyes hollow. "You cannot take him," screamed. But Nuru only smiled. "He has already been chosen." The storm roared louder, the flames flared, and suddenly the church walls began to weep. Dark liquid that smelled like blood and incense. Rushed forward, clutching her son, and for a moment everything stopped. The thunder froze, the shadows paused, and Nuru's face cracked, literally cracked as though a mask splitting to reveal something beneath. Through the fissures, a deep red glow pulsed, and a voice not his own spoke. "This is not your world anymore." Screamed as the light swallowed her, and when the villagers came at dawn, the church was silent again. Only the preacher stood there, calm, smiling, his robes unstained, as if nothing had happened. But on the floor lay two small footprints, burned into the stone, one large, one small, both facing the altar. That night the villagers heard two voices crying from inside the church, one soft, one deep, blending into a melody so sorrowful it made even the strongest men weep. And in the morning the river turned the color of wine, and the baobab tree by the market split in half. The elders gathered in fear, whispering, "The ancestors have turned away." But the truth was worse. Something darker had taken their place. From that day, even the shadows had waked, and the people of Aluo learned to never walk alone once the sun went down. By the 5th week after the red moon, Aluo's nights had become unrecognizable, as if the village itself had entered a shadow world. Pastor Nuru's church, no longer a simple place of prayer, pulsed with a strange life, and the villagers began to speak in whispers of the ritual of broken souls. An event, they claimed, happened during the dead of night when the preacher summoned the spirits. Nobody dared approach, yet everyone felt its pull. Inside the church, Nuru prepared his altar with offerings more horrifying than before: white goats, bowls of palm wine, strands of hair, and clay figurines carved to resemble each family in the village. Blue flames licked the edges of the altar, and shadows danced along the walls like living fingers, stretching and twisting, reaching for those who dared look. The wind carried the scent of burnt incense, and something far darker, something metallic and sweet, like blood in sunlight. People outside swore they could hear children laughing and crying at the same time, voices blending in a way that made their stomachs churn. That night, returned, desperate to save her son from whatever had claimed him. She approached the church quietly, following footprints that glowed faintly in the red dust, and saw Nuru chanting from the black book in a voice not entirely human, his eyes shining gold and blue simultaneously. Behind him, the shadows had formed humanoid figures, with eyes like coal and mouths that whispered secrets of the dead. Her son, Tund, now pale as ash, stood beside him, hands raised as if he were part of the ritual, his eyes empty yet filled with an ancient knowledge. Screamed and ran forward, but the shadows shifted, wrapping around her like smoke, pressing the air from her lungs. Nero turned, smiling, and spoke softly. The children of the ancestors will follow the chosen path, and you cannot stop what has already begun. The flames swirled higher, forming circles on the floor that glowed with symbols no living person could read, and the air vibrated with the sound of drums played by invisible hands. Every villager within hearing distance trembled, feeling the pull of the ritual deep in their bones. As the night stretched, the shadows began to merge with the villagers' own silhouettes, twisting their reflections in mirrors, in water, in polished wood, until no one could tell where the body ended and the darkness began. Clutching her son, felt the spirits of past ancestors moving through the church, whispering warnings and curses alike. The ritual reached its peak when Nuru raised his hands to the sky, and the blue flames formed a bridge above the altar, connecting the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The church doors slammed shut as if possessed, trapping all within its walls, and the cries of the children echoed endlessly. By dawn, the villagers outside found only faint footprints in the red dust, and the air thick with the smell of burnt offerings. And those who dared glance at the church saw the shadows dancing inside, still chanting, still waiting, as if time itself had been broken by the ritual of broken souls. By the 6th week, Aluo was a village shadowed by fear, where even the wind seemed to whisper warnings, and every shadow held a secret. The church had become the epicenter of all that was strange and terrifying, its walls vibrating with the low hum of unseen spirits. And Pastor Nuru's presence grew more imposing by the day, his crimson robes flickering in the blue firelight like they were alive. Villagers spoke of hearing footsteps in empty huts, of animals disappearing into thin air, and of children speaking languages that belonged to no living soul. That night, when the red moon hung low and heavy over the village, the church doors opened by themselves, creaking with a sound like bones grinding together, and the silent spirits seemed to pour out into the courtyard. Their forms were faint and translucent, yet each movement carried weight and menace, bending reality around them. Still clinging to her son, Tund, approached the church, her heart pounding, the distant drums of ancestors vibrating through her chest. Inside, Pastor Nuru chanted from his black book, the blue flames around him twisting and forming faces of those long dead, their mouths moving without sound, their eyes fixed on the living. Tund stood beside him, pale and unmoving, his hollow eyes reflecting the spirits that swirled around the altar. The villagers outside watched in horror as the spirits reached toward the sky, forming a vortex of light and shadow that seemed to pull the clouds themselves into the red glow. Nero raised his hands, and the air grew thick, almost solid, as though the spirits themselves pressed against the living. Those who dared enter the church felt the air tighten in their chests, their breaths stolen by invisible hands, and whispers of the past and future filled their minds all at once. The elders tried to call upon the ancestors for protection, but the wind carried their prayers away, leaving only the unbroken chant of Nuru and the hollow cries of the silent spirits. Trembling, stepped forward, placing herself between her son and the preacher, screaming, "Release him!" But Nuru only smiled, his eyes reflecting the blue fire and the red moon, and said, the chosen walk the path of both worlds, and no mortal hand can alter fate. The blue flames flared higher, and the spirits circled faster, their silent wails echoing like 1,000 broken hearts. Suddenly, the red dust from the village square rose in a violent swirl, forming faces of the missing and the dead, silently screaming their rage and despair. For a moment, it seemed the earth itself would split, yet the preacher's hands held the vortex, commanding it as though it were an obedient servant. By dawn, the spirits had retreated, leaving a heavy silence. The villagers, trembling in every bone, their shadows stretched unnaturally long and dark, and the church once again stood quietly, but no one dared approach it. From that day forward, Aluo learned a painful truth. The preacher's church was no ordinary place of worship. It was a threshold between worlds, where the living and the dead intertwined. And the night of the silent spirits was a warning that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. By the 7th week, Aluo was a village gripped by a fear so deep that even the sunlight seemed hesitant to touch its red dust streets. The church, now a looming monument of dark power, pulsed with blue flames that rose from the ground like serpents of light, and Pastor Nuru moved within them as though the fire itself obeyed him. Whispers carried through the village at night, voices of the forgotten speaking secrets to those brave or foolish enough to listen. Tund, the boy claimed by the preacher, walked silently alongside him, his hollow eyes reflecting the spirits that filled the church. Villagers told stories of glimpsing ghostly faces in their wells, of seeing their own reflections turn into strangers, and of hearing names called in tones older than time. One evening, an elder named Oba approached the church with a small group, carrying offerings to plead for mercy. The air grew thick as they neared, and the red dust rose, swirling into patterns that resembled eyes that seemed to follow their every move. Inside, the church was alive. Shadows moved along the walls, twisting into humanoid forms, their faces blank but their eyes burning with an unholy light. Pastor Nuru read from the Black Book, his voice a low chant that resonated with the walls, the floor, and even the air itself. Each syllable seemed to pull the villagers into another realm, one where time and space had no meaning. Tund stood beside the preacher, his movements precise, as if he had become part of the ritual, a child of both worlds. Oba knelt and begged, "Release us. Release our children." But the shadows swirled around him, whispering names of those already lost, and Oba's voice was swallowed by the chanting. Blue flames licked the faces of the villagers, showing them visions of the forgotten faces of ancestors, of missing children, of those who had dared challenge Nuru. Each vision carried a warning. The church had claimed its due, and the living could only watch as the veil between worlds thinned further. Suddenly, the flames twisted, forming a massive eye above the altar, its gaze sweeping over every soul inside and outside the church. The villagers felt their hearts seize. The eye was everywhere and nowhere, yet its judgment was absolute. Nuru lifted his hands, and the shadows receded into the red dust, leaving behind a silence so profound that even the wind dared not stir. By dawn, the villagers were changed forever, their eyes haunted, their bodies trembling, and their faith irrevocably tethered to the power of the church they had once hoped would save them. And in the quiet, the elders whispered in fear, "The forgotten watch us now," and the preacher commands their eyes. By the 8th week, Aluo had become a village suspended between worlds, where red dust whispered secrets of the forgotten. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across cracked earth, and even the sunlight seemed reluctant to touch the streets, as if fearing to disturb the unseen. Pastor Nero's church now dominated the horizon, its blue flames twisting toward the blood-red moon, casting dancing silhouettes across the village that seemed to move of their own accord. And villagers walked past with their heads bowed, their hearts pounding with terror, yet drawn by a force they could not name. Inside, the preacher moved like a god among mortals, his crimson robes catching the eerie firelight, the black book in his hands radiating a presence older than memory. Every word he spoke, a thread pulling the living closer to the unseen. Tund, the pale child who had disappeared weeks before, now stood at the altar like a sentinel, his hollow eyes reflecting the fire, the moon, and the shadows that twisted and whispered in unison. Villagers outside the church swore they could see the faces of their ancestors forming within the red dust, mouths moving silently, eyes pleading and accusing at once. And mothers clutched their children, while old men trembled on their knees, praying to gods who seemed deaf. Desperate to save her son, approached cautiously, clutching a small charm Mama Kemi had given her before death, whispering prayers that seemed to fall into a void. As she stepped across the threshold, the church seemed to inhale, the floor pulsing under her feet, the walls bending subtly as if alive, and the blue flames twisted into horns, wings, and faces that reached out toward her, pressing her into the shadows. Nero's eyes glowed with gold and fire red, his lips moving in tandem with a voice older than time itself. "You cannot stop what has begun." Then Tund lifted his hand, and the shadows bent and swirled, forming a vortex connecting the earth to the sky, the living to the dead, each soul caught in the pull of the preacher's will. Outside, the villagers trembled, their cries swallowed by the wind as ghostly figures emerged from the red dust, silently screaming names of the lost. Clutched her charm, whispering Mama Kemi's protective words. And for a fleeting moment, the vortex wavered. But Nero's raised hands sent the blue flames spiraling higher, engulfing all in their unnatural light. And the silent spirits of the ancestors wailed in sorrow, trapped between obedience and despair. While the preacher's voice rose above everything, a final prayer, binding the village to a fate that could not be undone. When dawn arrived, the red moon vanished, leaving a pale, hesitant sun over a village irrevocably changed, its people emerging with hollow eyes and elongated shadows, the church silent but still looming, its embers faintly glowing as a reminder of the night when the living and dead had converged. And Pastor Nuru had spoken the last prayer of Aluo. From that day onward, no one dared enter the church again. And the story of the preacher, the pale child, the blue flames, and the silent spirits became a whispered warning, passed from one generation to the next. Some faiths demand more than devotion, and some prayers should never be answered.